Cancorla. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak briefly on this very important bill and to thank People Before Profit for the great work they've done on the bill and for bringing it before us today. And of course the timing couldn't be more appropriate or fortuitous of a discussion of this bill, because it does seem that our housing and homelessness crisis, they've reached certainly emergency heights, and the idea of coming forward with a HEMPI bill, with a bill that is prepared in the rental area to utilise the same kind of dramatic action that we saw taken on behalf of the banks and the bankers 6, 7, 8 years ago, I think is totally appropriate. It's what the government should have done, and indeed I think what the next government will definitely have to do after the general election. As you know, earlier this afternoon I had a topical issues debate to which the Minister here today, Deputy English, kindly responded on the lack of communication with families currently in homeless accommodation and their upcoming move-out dates, as they feel, on the 1st of July. And in just 6 weeks, Minister Coveney had promised to move 1,256 families with 2,563 children into alternative, more suitable accommodation. And the bill before us today, of course, seeks to amend the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 and utilises, as I said, the same principle as the financial emergency measures in the public interest legislation. But the general thrust of the bill, of course, is that emergency measures are absolutely now necessary for the common good in the housing area, and that's why I fully support and welcome this bill, Cancorla. Indeed, of course, it echoes what I've been saying for at least 2 years now, that the crisis is so severe and deepening that drastic action is required by government to address it meaningfully, and it's no use to come in with a mantra, as Minister Coveney did earlier in the debate, about rent certainty and rent predictability and so on, when you're not prepared actually to regulate the market, which is the most important market of having a roof over your head. And Section 2 of the bill, of course, inserts the new Chapter 5A into the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, and this chapter deals with fair rent areas, as it's called, rightly, and would link rent increases to consumer price index. And before Christmas, of course, Dublin and Cork City were named rent pressure zones in the government's rent certainty, so-called rent certainty legislation by Minister Coveney. And by the end of January, of course, this year, the Minister had designated 23 more towns and Galway City as RPZs. Rent pressure zones are those areas where rent is above the national rent and have had more than 7% rental inflation in 4 of the preceding 6 quarters. And rent increase in these areas cannot be more than 4% for 3 years. But new properties and those which have been substantially refurbished, of course, are exempt from the limit. And RPZs only exist for 3 years and apparently can't be extended beyond that. So that's the value, I think, of the bill before us and the proposal before us today, that the measures are far stronger and will go much further in providing real stability, affordability and security of tenure for tenants. Census 2016, of course, showed that the cost of renting in Dublin City has increased by almost 30% since 2011, while renting in Dún Laoghaire increased by 26%, in Fingal County by almost 23%, and in South Dublin by almost 23%, and by Kildare by 20%. And the average weekly rent paid to private landlords in April 2016 was up 17% on 2011. But those figures, of course, the Minister referred to, the rate of increase slowing and so on, reminds me of a former leader of Fine Gael and Taoiseach, Mr Gareth Fitzgerald, who was always talking about the rate of increase of unemployment. I think at the time was always slowing, but it was still increasing, and that was the problem that we had to deal with when Mr Fitzgerald held that chair in the 80s. On Tuesday this week, the Simon Communities launched its Locked Out of the Market 7, the gap between rent supplement HAP limits and market rents, which showed that almost 90% of properties for rent are unaffordable to people on housing supports. And that's a shocking indictment, really, Minister, of the department under your senior minister. An example of a gap of around €800 for a 2-bed place in Dublin was cited. In a study over 3 days, they found that just 12% of the available 600 properties were affordable within the rent supplement HAP payment limits. And yet you told me, you reiterated again and again in our earlier debate, Minister, HAP was working. It was working for our people facing homelessness or in homeless accommodation. And of that, only 2 properties were affordable to a single person and just 7 properties for a couple who received those payments. The study also showed that there are now 48% less homes available to let than there were in May 2015. At a briefing on this bill organised by Deputy Boyd Barrett earlier this week, representatives from Focus Ireland and Threshold also demonstrated how broken the current housing sector is. Focus has been working directly with families entering homelessness and have previously said that rent increases were the #1 reason for homelessness in families, which is certainly my experience, Minister, as well. When people have become homeless, it's always that they're facing increased rents or attempts by landlords to use various devices to evict people and then get increased rents when they're gone. Now, however, the main reason, of course, is in reality evictions due to landlords selling up. And where exactly, Minister, is this being monitored? Even though a landlord signs a statutory declaration to say that the property will be sold, where's the follow-up? On Tuesday last also, Mr Mike Allen made a very apt analogy that people allowing vacant properties in such a crisis is, and I quote, is comparable with hoarding food in the middle of a famine. And he's completely right. And there's more than enough vacant property and land across the country, but the government again seems to be too scared, as they're scared to act and to achieve real rent certainty, or even to begin a local authority housing programme, seriously begin such a programme, rather than the kind of feeble efforts we've had so far from Minister Coveney and Minister English. Census 2016 gave us the up-to-date figures and showed that there has been a 15% decrease in the number of vacant dwellings between 2011 and 2016, but 62% of those are holiday homes, but that still leaves 183,000 other vacant dwellings. And for the first time, of course, in Census 2016, the types of dwellings was captured in relation to identifying vacant dwellings. And of course, we found towns in Cavan and counties like Cavan and Leitrim where you had massive developments in the proportionately in the Celtic Tiger era, represented a very high proportion of those. Rebuilding Ireland, of course, has a target of 47,000 units of social housing down to 2021, yet the vast majority of this is provided through the private rented sector and through the HAP, the Housing Assistance Programme. There are currently around 21,000 HAP tenancies across Ireland, including 7,000 which have moved from rent supplements to HAP. But I've consistently been questioning, as I did earlier with the Minister, the appropriateness and effectiveness of this programme, as while your housing need is considered to be met in a HAP tenancy, the local authority has no part in the tenancy and therefore gives none of the security of the previous rental accommodation scheme. And Mr Coveney continues to repeat the mantra, but even since I spoke to you last, Minister, talking to a constituent who's facing homelessness in 2 weeks' time, I mean, she's in Fingal County, she has been endlessly trying to access HAP-type accommodation, because the last thing a family like hers need, you know, with all the issues that a young family has, is to become homeless in 2 weeks. She doesn't want to go into that system, but there's no, you know, nobody wants to know when HAP is mentioned. So I'd urge you again, and Minister Coveney, in whatever the formulation of the next government is, if you could give the local authorities a direct role in the provision of HAP, in other words, to make them ultimately responsible for securing HAP tenancies, because certainly in the Dublin region, your current policy is not working. There are now almost 7,500 homeless people in Ireland. There's been a huge increase in family homelessness, and especially in the 18 to 24 years cohort, and 10% of the population now living in overcrowded conditions, according to Census 2016, and tens of thousands are languishing on the housing waiting list. And it has to be said that we're talking about you know, what history is going to write, Clancorla, about various people, about the outgoing Taoiseach or the outgoing Minister for Finance, you know, as if history was some stern person in the future. History, of course, will be just scholars in the years to come, what their judgment will be. And their judgment, despite all the palaver in the papers today, may very well be very harsh in relation to the outgoing Taoiseach and the outgoing, perhaps, Minister for Housing, in that we've had this scandal, this desperate suffering by families and children in homeless accommodation, and you've allowed it to go on. And we've seen so many ministers, so many redress schemes have been brought forward over scandals in the past. And one thing that history might be writing about in the 2020s or 2030s is making redress to the children who are suffering tonight and who are living in this kind of accommodation tonight. So I think this modest bill, simple, straightforward bill, is the way to go. We do need an emergency housing legislation, and I commend people for profit for bringing it forward.
Thank you very much, Deputy
Broughan.